Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is episode 10, I think, of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We're reading Ulysses in the Bathtub. We are on chapter 2. I think I can say fairly truthfully that the chapters of Ulysses that I most enjoy reading in the bathtub, and the ones that I can totally enjoy in the bathtub, are the first two chapters of Ulysses, and then the first two chapters of Bloom when he comes up in the fourth and fifth chapters, I believe. I know you're probably sick of it by now, but I'm working on the assumption that people aren't going to religiously watch all of these videos. But I do want to come back to these little sort of narrative shifts that we understand as readers, and that writers, good writers, are always playing to. And I would say that Joyce is playing to these expectations on the part of the readers very rigorously, to the point that we have to constantly be paying much more attention than we would normally do. But they're the same techniques. So we'll go back to, I want to think again about not only what we're getting from the text, but all the stuff we're not getting, and all the stuff that we are imagining and filling in for the story, since the writer isn't going to give us every detail. The boring writers try to put every detail in. Choo choo, our first line, our train, could be delivered many ways better. It doesn't have to give us everything. It doesn't have to tell us how many cars are on the train or what direction it's going in. When I read, students are having trouble with these passages. They tell me it was proceeding in a north-northwest direction over the such and such mountains at a speed of 47 miles. All this stuff that really loses the reader. The reader will bring in a lot of this other stuff. We don't know which direction it's going. We don't know what time of day it is. And there's a train there. Okay, we need that. And we know we're looking at it when he says, "Giddy up, Maybelline, Rory Calhoun shouted into the dry desert wind, let's go get us some money." So we see something, and then we shift to someone speaking, and that shift brings a lot of things besides just Rory Calhoun's name. It brings point of view, it brings location, and most importantly, the thing that Joyce will constantly be clear about, time. What time it is. It's the time he speaks, and as he proceeds after the train. Suddenly, a conical gray whirlwind appeared on the horizon. We have a voice, we've got a train, and suddenly we see something. Now, look at all the stuff we don't have here. It may not be a great image, but we don't know exactly when it appeared. Maybe it was there before he saw it, but we only know that he's seeing it, so it's in sequence. Suddenly, it appeared, but we know it's implied that Rory suddenly sees the whirlwind. And this is because it's made clear because the sequence is clear in a good writer. Or a mediocre writer, as this proves. So we see something. We don't know exactly what time it appeared. We don't know its relationship even to the train. Is it to the right of the train, to the northeast of the train? Again, when my students are having trouble writing, they'll try to explain how many miles away, 375 yards from the rear caboose of the train they'll try to describe all these locations. As readers, we see two things. We'll place them in our little landscape. Joyce is asking us to do this all the time, as all good writers do. So then we shift again. We see something. Jumpin' Jehoshaphat. We don't have our little dialogue line here. So if there's no dialogue line, and it sounds like dialogue, and we know who the point of view is, we know it's Rory thinking that. There's a lot of complicated things you're doing as a reader. Jumpin' Jehoshaphat. Okay, I know that's Rory. I have no trouble. You have to do that all the time in Ulysses. Know who's thinking, and when they've stopped talking, when they've started thinking. Okay, same thing, Jumpin' Jehoshaphat. Now we get the dialogue line. It's headed straight towards us. Now, we don't need to describe in the previous, as the students are having so much trouble. We don't need to say, the whirlwind was heading towards Rory as he traced towards. We don't need to explain all that stuff, because he thinks, oh my God, and then he shouts to Maybelline. We know it's not Maybelline speaking. It's headed straight towards us. We know the imminence of it through the point of view and through the dialogue. Basic techniques of fiction. Again, we know that's not Maybelline. But maybe it is Maybelline. Or maybe it's Rory's girlfriend who's riding behind him. We don't know she's there yet. We know it's him because he's the default voice previously, so we don't have to keep saying Rory said, Rory exclaimed, Rory said, because he was the last one who spoke. It's implied that he speaks now. All the basics of fiction. Okay. All the information that we get, that my students work so hard to bury and to pour into these passages, about where Rory comes from, why he's robbing the train, what his girlfriend's name is, where he comes from, what color his eyes are. All this information doesn't fit the narrative as it's coming at us. And we'll see this often I'm in a very allergy-prone area here in Central Coast. We'll have, we won't get the information that many people, and you'll see bad writers do it all the time in published books, that you want to shove into the text because there's not a place for them. The information can't come into the passage of time as we see it. Let's look at one of the easiest chapters in the book to read of Ulysses, and one of my favorites. It's a nicely put together little chapter, and this is chapter 2. It's the shortest chapter 2, which makes it also a lot easier to read. And let's look at the first page. I'm going to try to kind of skim through this whole chapter with you a bit, but let's particularly each episode just look at those first few pages. And what do we have? Now, we have a little time break here. This is a chapter break or whatever. It's signaling that this is the next significant passage. I don't want to give too much structural stuff, but there's 24 chapters. Each corresponds to an hour in the characters' lives, and they're sequential. Okay, time is, we never get as we get in, like a Robert Harris novel or some boring bestseller, 9:27 a.m. Martello Towers, or 12:14 p.m. Berlin. We don't get any of these time tags because, like good writers, Joyce doesn't give a fuck what time it is. He wants you to know you're in a period of time that's passing. That's much more important. And we know it's in the morning. Now, the other thing that's happened here is even though we have a 700-page novel taking place over 24 hours, Joyce is still skipping ahead, like all good writers, to the next significant moment. We don't get Stephen going to school, getting his pencils and erasers out, letting the students into the class. We cut to the middle of a good scene, like any good writer like Joyce. So we cut to this. You, Cochrane, what city sent for him? Now, we don't know who the voice is. We are probably in the point of view of the person speaking. I think almost implied, though it's tricky. Then we get Tarentum, sir. Very good. Well, there was a battle, sir. Now, there's 4 lines of dialogue. Look at all the stage directions he doesn't have to do, because we can hear it in the voices. We're getting someone's being interrogated. We're looking at this boy replying. Very good. Well, get on with it. So we have the pressure of the child. We're not even looking at the child, but we have the teacher-student relationship. There was a battle, sir. Very good. Where? The boy's blank face asked the blank window. 5 sentences, 5 paragraphs. We now know so much about how the story is going to progress. We don't know yet it's Stephen's point of view. It's implied, usually in a book, if the point of view of the previous chapter was Stephen, we're probably in his point of view. But if we're going to shift, we're going to have to shift quickly. We have a nice piece of dialogue. We have a pressure situation where the teacher, whose point of view we're in, is interrogating the child. And then we get that great sentence, the boy's blank face asked the blank window. Right then we know that the point of view is not the child, because we're watching the child look out the window and ask the window the question, or try to answer to the window. And that's the point of view of what turns out to be Stephen. Okay, so all of that's happening. We're processing a lot in those 4 or 5 fairly simple lines of the story, but it's going to get more complicated doing the same things. All right. Now we get into a little interior shift. So you should be looking at this on the page in front of you. The boy's blank face asked the blank window. Now look what happens in the next few paragraphs. Fabled by the daughters of memory. And yet it was in some way, if not as memory fabled it. A phrase then of impatience, thud of Blake's wings of excess. I hear the ruin of all space, shattered glass, and toppling masonry. And time, one livid final flame, What's left us then? I forget the place, sir. 279 BC? Asculum, Stephen said, glancing at the name and date in the gore-scarred book. Now, one of the things I'm going to advise you to do is, I don't even remember all the things he's referring to here. Stephen, we drop into Stephen's thoughts. You see how clearly it's laid out? Just like this. It's a paragraph. It's sort of isolated by itself, so that helps us know it's in his head. Because we're getting that information from his head, we know it's Stephen's. It's not the kid. It's not anybody else in the room. And then you're getting used to the interior voice of Stephen, which is a very complicated voice. And one of the hardest things about Ulysses to follow. Because he's very bright, he's very erudite, he's very pompous, he's very pretentious. He likes to use lots of references, and he also has a poetic flair to his prose, interior thoughts. No one thinks like this, right? Nobody. This is not stream of consciousness. This is writing. No one thinks like this. But Joyce manufactures these lovely images and thoughts, one after another, about war, about what happens at the end of a war. What we'll do if we're reading this book wrong is we'll go to our various shelves and pull down the reference books and find out what war he's talking about in Pyrrhus and what Pyrrhic victory means and all this stuff. Don't think about it. He's quizzing a kid. The kid should know something. And in the moment that the boy is staring out the window, look at how that works. The boy's blank face asks the blank window, fabled by the daughters of memory. While he's looking at the child looking out the window, he thinks. When he finishes thinking, I forget the place, sir. 279 BC. Asculum, Stephen said. We don't have to have Joyce saying, Stephen began to think about his experiences and his thoughts about war and what war meant because he was very upset and living a very sad life. We don't have any explanatory phrases. We just have the thoughts as they appear. The thoughts are appearing in sequence. This is the thing that will help you with Ulysses. Any good writer is trying to do this. And so many of my students just don't get the sequence thing at all. It's the simplest part of fiction. The thoughts happen as the boy's looking out the window, then the boy says something, he stops thinking. Okay? It's that simple. What's going to bog you down is if you try to understand every phrase in there. Just understand he's a very pretentious man, he's a very intelligent young man, he has very dark thoughts, and there's some beautiful lines of poetry in it. I hear the ruin of all space, shattered glass and toppling masonry, and time, one livid final flame, what's left us then. And then we have a lot of understanding of Stephen, which you can't get from your reference books. Now, let's go ahead with the next page or two. He talks to the boys and he looks at the boys. And when the boys show up, as any good writer, if they're going to be a significant character for a few moments, we see them. On page 29, Armstrong, a boy who can't go play because he has to do sums for the headmaster, comes up to him and says, I can't play, and Stephen tries to help him. And as soon as Stephen sees him, we look at the boy and we breathe what he smells like and what he's been eating. And then Stephen sits down with him and helps the boy with his sums. Okay? And then he sends the boy off to play. Now, I want to look at this one passage. I'm sorry, it's page 33. After the quiz, after the explanation and the lecture, and then he gives them a disappointing riddle. The boys are all excited because there's a riddle being given them, and then he gives them a riddle that isn't very funny to them. And then the boy shows up. Who is the boy now? Sergeant. Sergeant shows up on page 33. Let's look at this again. The boy shows up, most normal thing to do. A character comes into your point of view's range, and we see the boy for a few moments. And then we get Stephen's thoughts. So we're seeing the boy while Stephen thinks about a lot of other things. And you'll listen to all the little shifts in the sentences here. Ugly and futile. So he sees this boy. This whole chapter is about feeling just completely giving up. Ugly and futile. Lean neck and tangled hair, and a stain of ink, a snail's bed. Yet someone had loved him, borne him in her arms and in her heart. But for her, the race of the world would have trampled him underfoot, a squashed, boneless snail, like the snail of this ink stain. She had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. Was that then real? The only true thing in life? His mother's prostrate body, the fiery Columbanus in holy zeal bestrode, she was no more. Okay, I don't want to keep going, but I want to just see in that long paragraph, you can hear the transition here, looking at the small boy, and then again, we know Stephen's mother's died because of the dialogue with Buck, and he's thinking about his own mother. So only a mother could love this kind of pathetic little kid. And then he thinks of his own mother and her death. Okay, so we're getting a lot of kind of... Stephen's a fairly dark character in this book. Now we go to page 35. Mr. Deasy is out. There's a headmaster named Mr. Deasy who's out in the schoolyard. He's a horrible man, and you don't need to hear his voice very much. And he's shouting at the kids. And when Stephen comes out to get him because he wants to get his money, we have this man running around, and he turned his angry white mustache. Again, when we get descriptions from good writers, Flaubert, or Dennis Johnson, or Brian Moore, or George Simenon, they don't give us the whole picture. They give us what the person sees, the angry mustache. And so that's what Stephen's looking at, and it's an image that helps us put the rest of the picture together, like Choo Choo does. Now, what is it now? He cried continually without listening. Stephen's evaluation of it. Cochrane and Halliday on the same side, sir, Stephen cried. Now there's another thing you'll see in good writers. Stephen has come out onto the pitch. He sees the children playing. He sees Deasy shouting at them. We don't hear what he's hearing, what's Deasy shouting, because he's just running around being annoying. And Stephen says Cochrane and Halliday are on the same side, sir, because he has heard Deasy sending people in the wrong teams or something. We don't need every detail. We're moving on to the significant details, and the significant details for Steve. Now, we get, look at this. Here's another perfect transition. We get this all the time in good writers. Mr. Deasy goes off fussily to play, and he says, go meet me in my room. And you'll see this here on page 35. It'll be more confusing in Ulysses mainly because of the voice of Stephen. But the transitions are not unusual transitions. He sends him to his room, and then we see Deasy running off. The next paragraph, in the middle of page 35, stale, smoky air hung in the study with the smell of drab, braided leather of its chairs. Look how effortlessly Joyce gets us from the football pitch, and he just puts us in the room. And the first thing he does when he puts us in the room is he gives us the smell of it and a couple of images of that room. We then go on to describe the coins and some of the guy's collections and so forth, but that's a normal skilled transition. But he gives us something to see and smell. Now, Deasy returns, and he says, first, our little financial settlement, he said. Now, this is bottom of page 35. We now have a scene set between two characters. He brought out of his coat a pocketbook bound by a leather thong. It slapped open, and he took from it 2 notes, one of joined halves, and laid them carefully on the table. Look how often Joyce will try to give us sounds and smells besides just visuals. Okay, so I think he's got 2 pieces of paper here. Oh, there's 2 different coins, and one's been taped together, I guess. So he puts down 2 sheets of paper, and then we get a really nice description in the next page of the money being laid out in front of Stephen, his salary. We sort of turn the scene over to Deasy. He's a fairly pretentious and awful old man, and he starts to give Stephen a lot of lectures about basically, the best thing you can do in life, young man, is pay your way, and that's he's a teacher who could give a crap about anything except teaching people these old saws and these old cliches. And he says, "Put money in thy purse," as Shakespeare says at the top of page 37, and we get that nice simple reaction from Stephen. Iago, Stephen murmured. It's one of these guys quoting Shakespeare and Shakespearean characters, And Stephen says it's Iago who says that, who's obviously a villain in Othello. And we get a whole reaction of Stephen's thoughts about Deasy here, this kind of pompous old man. Now, I want to skip a little bit ahead because there's so many nice... Most of the scene you should be able to understand. There'll be lots of references to names, particularly Irish politics. But the gist of the scene, and don't worry if you don't understand them, what you'll see again and again is that Deasy's this old fart who blames everything on two people, the Jews and women. And that's the voice. I mean, this is comic, awful old man. And that's what the women did this, the women destroyed Parnell, the women destroyed Adam, and the Jews have come into the country and so forth. So in the midst of everything he says are these kind of bigoted old cliches. Now, he's sitting down. There's a couple nice little transitions here I want you to see. Mr. Deasy says, I want you to take a letter, because you're a literary sort. You hang out with your literary friends. And I want you to take some letters to the newspapers for me. Now watch this transition here. Stephen, while Deasy sits down to copy out his letter for Stephen to take, Stephen looks around the room. And watch this, see on page 39, I'm talking about sequence all the time, and time passing. As Deasy's typing, that's when Stephen looks around and sees all these glorifications of war paintings all over the walls, and looks at them and thinks about them. And in the middle of looking at them, full stop, Mr. Deasy bade the keys, but prompt ventilation of this important question. Now look how we've already got him at the typewriter, but we're getting Mr. Deasy thinking out loud, full stop, tap, and then he gets back to typing his stupid letter. And listen, now you can hear from the voice that it's the stupid letter. But prompt ventilation of this important question, and he's back typing again. This is really, really good writing. And you're going to see a lot of good writers learning a lot of this stuff from Joyce to this very day. Now, I'm going to skip through some of this here because the most interesting part is when Mr. Deasy's kind of pompousness kind of all comes out as full-blown, just bigoted old fartness, okay? And as he's in page 41, he starts to go on his diatribe about the Jews. Okay, Bloom's a Jew in 2 chapters from now, and really the central character of the book. And Mr. Deasy says, "Mark my words, Mr. Dedalus," he said. "England is in the hands of the Jews, in all the highest places, her finance, her press, and they are the signs of a nation's decay. Wherever they gather, they eat up the nation's vital strength. I have seen it coming these years, as sure as we are standing here. The Jew merchants are already at their work of destruction. Old England is dying. The Jews are destroying England." Okay, and he's an Ulsterman. He's a big old Tory, as he says. Now, a few paragraphs after that, Stephen doesn't say anything. So you have these long things. We just let this old bigot talk. Stephen never says anything except to remind him who Iago is and so forth. And then we get a merchant, Stephen said, is one who buys cheap and sells dear. Jew or Gentile, is he not? Now, this is a guy, Stephen, he wants to keep his job. He wants to keep the money coming in. This is his boss. He doesn't want to sit down and say you're a bigoted old fart, but he does want to say, well, you're saying Jew merchants, but don't all merchants do the same thing? And then we get from Deasy, they sinned against the light. Okay, so he kind of prods him enough to get even more vindictive hyperbole out of here. Now, one or two more nice little transitions. We have time. Page 42. Mr. Deasy is emboldened and going on and on about all this stuff. And look at this nice little transition where we sort of see Stephen's vision of the world versus Mr. Deasy's. "The ways of the Creator are not our ways," Mr. Deasy said. "All history moves towards one great goal, the manifestation of God." Stephen jerked his thumb towards the window, saying, "That is God." "Hooray! I, were we!" It's the noise of the children, the chaotic noise of the children in the playground. "What?" Mr. Deasy said. "A shout in the street," Stephen answered. So God is just this noise, this kind of unidentifiable noise that you hear outside. And then Mr. Deasy says, well, I'm happier than you. He recognizes that Stephen's being cynical. He says, well, you're just not a happy young man like I am. Now, we're almost done here. I want to just skip through. We get a nice little piece about his opinions of women, particularly faithless women. We're going to have faithless women in the book, particularly Molly. Or unfaithful, what am I saying? Unfaithful, a quote, unquote, unfaithful woman. And he goes on about that, and Helen of Troy, etc. And Stephen says, I don't want to be a teacher, I want to be a learner. It's a really nice little passage to understand Stephen, talking about what he wants out of life. Not to go around giving lectures to people or writing notes to the newspapers about the hoof and mouth disease, but he just wants to learn from the world. And we will see that's one of the most appealing parts of Stephen's personality. Now, Stephen leaves, and again, we've seen all these nice little shifts between, again, the same thing. Were we, I, yow, choo, choo. Points to the window and we hear the noise. Okay? We're always placed in these scenes. We're not getting any information. It doesn't come out of the moments of the scenes as they progress. And as we get to the end, Mr. Deasy's making some racist joke, and he's laughing so hard that Stephen just gets up and goes. And then Mr. Deasy chases after Stephen as Stephen's leaving with his money. And he wants to make a joke with him. Page 44. I'll just summarize it. But if you look at those that last passage is lovely. The way it's written, the last part of this chapter. As Mr. Deasy comes up, we see him, we hear this phlegm in his throat, and he's saying, you know why Ireland has never persecuted the Jews? Do you know why our country has been so good not to persecute the Jews, unlike all the other countries in the world? Because we never let them in. And then he just starts laughing at this horrible joke. So it's not, again, you can read this, as many of the books will, is about how the book is all about the mistreatment of the Jews in Ireland and so forth. I don't think that's what the book's about at all. It's about Stephen and Bloom at this moment of time that Joyce recalled very vividly, and the attitudes of people towards people like Bloom, or even people like Stephen, you and your literary friends. So that's the context of it, and this kind of horrible old man that, who runs a school. Mr. Deasy runs a school is a far more horrible indictment of Ireland, I think, of than any of the other kind of bigoted stuff he says. That this man is educating young men. Okay, so that's chapter 2. It's one of the best chapters. You should have no trouble following it, really. Just start to acclimate yourself to these little shifts, okay? The particular shifts interior to Stephen. The interior passages of Stephen are sometimes extremely erudite and confusing and complicated. Look for the poetry in them. And look for the emotions of them, because there's a very complex emotional life in there. And don't worry so much if you miss some of the references. All right, I promise I'll get rid of this now. And next week we'll do chapter 3, which I find a little more difficult than this one. Okay? I'm trying to turn off the wrong computer. Okay, bye. See you next week.